We treat the silence of the universe as a void to be filled, never realizing that the silence is actually a mercy. We beg for signs, for youth, for power, or for the truth, believing that our desires are harmless. Tonight, I bring you the records of 5 individuals who met a man on a damp forest trail. A man who offered them exactly what they asked for. They thought they were being clever. They thought they were being bold. But as Nigel, Louise, Tom, Mike, and Amber soon discovered, the universe doesn't give gifts. It only offers trades. And the cost of an answered prayer is usually everything you have left to lose. My name is Titus Abueja, and tonight we'll learn why you should be very careful what you wish for. You might just be heard.
Five hikers were walking the last stretch of a 3-day trek through the forest. They'd met through a local hiking group and didn't know each other well. Their packs were lighter than the day before. They talked about food, showers, and the drive home. The trail narrowed as it dipped into a shaded area where the trees grew close together. The ground was damp. Roots crossed the path. Someone in front slowed down. A man sat on a fallen log a few steps off the trail. His clothes were dirty and torn. His shoes had no laces. A plastic bag lay beside him, flat and empty. When he saw the hikers, he stood up and asked if they had water. One of the hikers handed him a bottle. Another took a sandwich from their pack and passed it over. The man sat back down. He drank with both hands and paused often. He ate the sandwich slowly, holding it close. When he finished eating, he said, "Because of the kindness you have shown me, I'll grant each one of you a wish, but just one. So think of it very carefully." The hikers looked at each other. One of them smiled, and another one shrugged. Someone said, "He's probably lost or hungry." The man nodded. He drank the water from the bottle and wiped his hands on his jacket. "One wish per person," he said. "Say it out loud." The hikers didn't argue. Each person said one wish. The first person said, "I wish to be young again." The second one said, "I wish to have the power to stop time." Third one said, "Well, I wish to have the power to speak to the dead." The next person, who doesn't want to be outsmarted, said, "I wish I could never be lied to." And finally, the fifth hiker, feeling smarter than the last one, "I wish I know what everyone really think of me." The old man stayed where he was. The trees didn't move. Nothing changed. "They're done." One of them laughed and said they should keep going. They wished the men luck and returned to the trail. That evening, the hikers reached the parking area. They loaded their packs into their cars and then drove home. The next morning, the wishes began to happen. They were small at first, enough to be noticed. By the end of the day, each of them remembered what they'd said in the forest. Nigel Scott lived alone in a clean apartment in the middle of Somerset City. Everything worked, and the furniture was good. Nothing felt personal. He was in his early 50s, divorced, and well paid. He was trusted at work and was rarely questioned. His days ended on time and without surprises. But that was the problem. His children were grown and lived far away. They had families and busy lives. They called sometimes. He called when he remembered to. The conversations were polite. No one seemed to need him. The divorce had been calm. Work slowly replaced home. The talking had stopped. And when it ended, it felt settled, which somehow hurt more. Nigel didn't think he had failed. He had followed the plan. School, career, family, stability. He avoided all major mistakes. Still, something felt unfinished. He joined the hiking group on impulse. He wanted to move, to be around people without expectations. He mostly listened. The others were younger and spoke about problems he remembered having once. Back in the woods, Nigel wished first. He spoke before thinking. I wish I could be young again. The words felt small, slightly embarrassing. At the end of the hike, everyone went home. Nigel returned to his apartment. He ate, slept, and forgot about the forest. When he woke up in the morning, the room felt wrong. It was too large. He stood up and lost his balance. His pajama bottoms slipped down and pulled around his ankles. He grabbed them and noticed his hands. They were small. Nigel froze. Something had worked. Nigel learned quickly that panic was useless. His parents saw nothing wrong. Breakfast happened on schedule. He was told to hurry. He was told what to wear. When he tried to speak seriously, he only got ignored. He didn't own time anymore. School has confirmed it. The building was smaller than he remembered, and louder than he expected. The bell decided everything. Desks were cramped. Chairs were uncomfortable. He sat where he was told and stayed there. A boy behind him kicked his chair. "Stop," Nigel said calmly. The boy smiled and kicked it again. Nigel reported it to the teacher. She told him to ignore it, but the kicking continued. At recess, the bully made himself clear. He was taller, louder, surrounded by friends. He bumped into Nigel on purpose and laughed when Nigel dropped his lunch. Nigel spoke carefully, but the boy punched him in the shoulder. It didn't hurt much. What hurt was how pointless the words had been. Nigel reported his bully again. Teachers listened with tired faces and wrote notes, but nothing changed. the bully learned that rules were slow and mostly harmless. In class, Nigel knew every answer. He raised his hand once and corrected the mistake. The teacher frowned and told him not to interrupt. The class laughed. He stopped raising his hand. By the end of the day, Nigel understood the rule. Logic didn't matter. Experience didn't matter. Size did. When the final bell rang, he felt relief too soon. Tomorrow arrived before he reached the door. At home, his parents asked how school was. It was fine, Nigel said, and they believed him. That night, lying in a bed that was too small, Nigel stared at the ceiling and accepted the truth. He hadn't been sent back to fix the same thing. He'd been sent back to endure it again. By the third week, Nigel stopped arguing with reality. School became routine. The bully lost interest once he learned Nigel wouldn't fight back. Teachers continued to misunderstand him. Reporting problems changed nothing. Knowing how systems worked only made it harder to accept that he had no power inside them. Nigel learned to stay quiet. That was when Daniel started sitting next to him. Daniel talked too much and laughed easily. He hated rules and complained about school every day. One afternoon, while poking at his lunch, Daniel said it out loud. "I wish I could just grow up already." Nigel froze. Daniel kept talking about homework, about being small, about not being taken seriously. Nigel listened without interrupting. Every complaint sounded familiar. He had said them once. He just couldn't remember when. That night, Nigel thought about adulthood, about freedom that slowly turned into responsibility, about choices that felt temporary until they weren't. For the first time since the wish, he hesitated. He wasn't sure anymore which version of himself had suffered more. The next morning, the class buzzed with noise. Their teacher was sick. A substitute was coming. The door opened, and the man stepped in, carrying a stack of papers. Nigel recognized him immediately. The clothes were cleaner. The posture was the same. Calm, still, ordinary in a way that felt deliberate. The man turned his back to the class and rolled his name on the blackboard. Nigel didn't read it, but the man faced the room. His eyes moved slowly across the students and stopped on Nigel. He smiled and winked. "I see you got your wish," the man said. The bell rang, and class began. Louise Taylor woke before her alarm, aware of something small and wrong before she could name it. The bedside table looked crowded in a way it hadn't the night before. Between her phone and a half-empty glass of water sat a small brass counterbell, dulled with age, its surface marked by fine scratches, as though it had been used for years. Louise stared at it longer than felt reasonable, certain it hadn't been there when she went to sleep. There was no message, no packaging. There was no memory of buying it or being given it. She pressed it once, lightly, almost as a test. Nothing happened. The room stayed the same. The air felt unchanged. Embarrassed, she reached for her phone, then stopped. The clock on the wall hadn't moved. The second hand remained suspended between ticks, perfectly still. Louise waited, counting silently. It didn't advance. She rang the bell again. The clock resumed its motion immediately, the second hand snapping forward as if nothing had interrupted it. A sound came from the street outside. A car passed. Time returned without hesitation and without a pulse. She didn't ring the bell again that morning, but she thought about it constantly. The next time she used it, she stood at a pedestrian crossing, traffic frozen mid-flow, engines silent, exhaust hanging in the air like breath held too long. She crossed calmly without waiting for the light. When she rang the bell to resume time, the city continued without noticing her absence. That night, she slept deeply and woke feeling unchanged. Small uses followed. Skipping cues, avoiding awkward conversations, stepping away from meetings she no longer wanted to attend. Sometimes, after a shopping time for only a moment, she felt strained for the rest of the day. Other times, longer pauses left no trace at all. The bell stayed by her bed. Her use became less cautious. In frozen offices, she walked past desks and faces she recognized too well. Once she struck a colleague across the face with an open hand, feeling the shock of contact without consequence. Time resumed. No one reacted. The relief was immediate, followed by something colder. It was the mirror that stopped her. After only a few days, she noticed, in the bathroom light, the slight sag beneath her eyes, the unfamiliar heaviness in her posture, the way her reflection seemed tired in a way sleep didn't fix. She compared photographs, counted hours, tried to make sense of it. Some days she felt older. Other days she didn't. The bell offered no pattern, no fairness, and no warning. Louise stopped using the bell. She left it untouched for days, then longer, watching herself carefully, waiting to see if the change would slow or reverse. It did neither. Time moved normally again, but she felt permanently misaligned with it, as though she'd already spent something she couldn't get back. Louise hadn't planned to see her sister that afternoon. It was an unremarkable meeting. A coffee taken standing near the counter. A conversation that drifted between minor complaints and unfinished thoughts. Mid-sentence, her sister faltered. The cup slipped from her hands and shattered on the door. She collapsed without warning, striking the tiles hard enough to draw gasps from nearby tables. Someone shouted for help. someone else reached for a phone. Louise dropped to her knees, calling her sister's name, already knowing, but the way her body lay, that something had gone catastrophically wrong. Her breathing was shallow, uneven, then stopped altogether. Time, for once, was moving too fast. The bell was in her bag. Louise didn't remember putting it there. She didn't reach for it immediately. The scramble of strangers, the certainty settling in her chest that whatever help was coming wouldn't arrive quickly enough. She thought of mornings she had woken older without understanding why, of the mirror, of the days she had sworn never to ring it again. She pressed the bell. Everything stopped. Hand froze inches from her sister's shoulder. A voice hung open in the mouth and finished. The cafe became a still life of uninterrupted urgency. Every motion locked at the edge of action. Louise sat on the floor beside her sister and took her hand, feeling the warmth that wouldn't fade, the pulse that wouldn't strengthen. For the first time since the bell had appeared, she didn't stand up. She didn't walk away. She stayed. Time didn't demand anything immediately. The cost didn't announce itself. Louise felt only the slow ache in her joints, the heaviness in her body, the sense that she was moving forward alone again. She didn't ring the bell to resume the world. She didn't know if she could afford to. She remained there, holding her sister's hand, in a moment stretched beyond permission, knowing that when time finally returned, she would not return with it unchanged. The bell rested on the floor beside her. Silence, waiting. Tom arrived home late. He dropped his keys in the bowl and kicked off his shoes. The hike already felt like a memory of a memory. The man on the log, the damp forest, the stupid wish. It was just trail talk. Sleep came fast, but it wasn't deep. He woke up suddenly. A woman stood at the foot of his bed. She wasn't a glowing spirit. She looked like she had been pulled through a hedge backwards. Her coat was matted with burrs and heavy with the scent of a stagnant pond. "Please," she said. Her voice sounded like dry paper rubbing together. "I need your help." Tom's throat constricted. He tried to tell her to get out, but his jaw felt like it had been whacked shut. "You're dead," he managed to choke out. "Yes," she said, "and you're a door left off the latch." She didn't move her feet. She seemed to simply be closer. The air around her was cold, like bone-deep chill of a basement. "I need to speak," she said. "Move back." Before Tom could scream, his lungs inflated with a breath that wasn't his. It was stale and tasted of iron. His mouth opened wider than was comfortable, and a sound tore out from his chest. It was a woman's voice, wet and frantic. "I didn't mean for it to happen," Tom clapped his hands over his mouth, gagging. His own teeth bit into his palms as his jaw fought him, trying to force more words out. "Get out!" Tom gasped, falling from the bed. The woman looked down at him. There was no malice in her eyes, only a terrible, focused exhaustion. "I'll wait," she whispered. The room went empty. Morning was a fever dream of normality. Tom went to work, but he couldn't stop the twitch in his throat. Every time he spoke to a colleague, he felt a hiccup in his chest, a syllable trying to hitch a ride on his breath. By noon, the pressure was unbearable. It felt like his ribs were being pushed outward from the inside. He didn't decide to leave. He simply found himself driving, his hands tight on the wheel, steered by a frantic internal compass. He was suffocating, and the only way to catch his breath was to head toward a house he'd never seen before. He stood on a porch in the suburbs. A young woman opened the door. "Can I help you?" she asked. Tom didn't answer. He couldn't. He simply stood there as his body was hijacked. His diaphragm pumped like a bellows. The confession poured out of him. Dates, names, the location of a key, the truth about a hit and run. The woman went white, clutching the doorframe as this stranger spoke to her in her dead sister's exact cadence. When the last word left his lips, the pressure snapped. Palms slumped against the porch railing, drawing a ragged, clean breath of oxygen. The ghost of the sister appeared one last time. She looked at her sister, waiting for the peace to come, for the light to take her. But nothing happened. She remained gray, damp, and trapped. "Didn't work," she whispered, her voice fading. "I'm still here." She dissolved into the afternoon heat, but the cold didn't leave Tom's chest. He stood on the porch, alone in his body for the first time in 24 hours. But as he turned to leave, he felt a new weight settle behind his heart. A new pressure, sharper and more aggressive than the last. It began to push against his vocal cords. A different voice, manly, gruff, and terrified, echoed in the back of his mind. My turn. Mike woke to the sound of the fridge door closing and the familiar rhythm of Jane moving through the kitchen. Morning light slipped through the blinds, dull and gray. For a few seconds, the day felt ordinary. "I didn't finish the milk," Jane said from the doorway. Mike turned his head. On the bedside table sat the empty carton, light as paper. Before he could respond, a sharp pressure loomed behind his nose. A single warm drop landed on his pajama shirt. He frowned, wiped it away, and sat up. "You okay?" Jane asked. "Yeah," he said. The pressure didn't come back. He hadn't lied. He really did feel fine physically. It was Jane's tiny, pointless lie about the milk that had snapped the vessel. He told himself, it's just a fluke. At a training hospital, the air smelled of floor wax and recycled breath. As a physician's associate, Mike was the middleman, the one who translated the coldness of surgeons into something patients could swallow. In the corridor, a senior consultant passed him and flashed a practiced porcelain smile. "Great work on the admissions notes, Mikes. Very thorough." The pressure hit like a physical punch. Mike barely made it to the staff sink before a heavy, rhythmic pulse of crimson began splashing against the white porcelain. He stood there, leaning over the basin, shoving a wad of rough brown paper towels up his nostril. He thought about the forest. He thought about the man on the log, what his laceless shoes, and that tired, hollow smile. The wish had been a joke, a defense mechanism against the world of corporate doublespeak. I wish I could never be lied to. By midday, the front of Mike's scrubs was a map of dark, damp stains. The condition of the wish didn't care about intent. It didn't care about politeness. In the afternoon grand rounds, the head of medicine stood before a group of trembling interns, and he said, "We prioritize patient outcomes above all financial metrics." Mike's nose burst. It wasn't a drip, it was a spray. A fine mist of red hit the back of an intern's white coat. The room froze. The head of medicine stopped mid-sentence, staring at Mike with a look of profound guilt, as if his own lie had pulled the trigger. "Medical emergency," an intern shouted, reaching for Mike's pulse. "I'm fine." Mike wheezed through a saturated mask. The bleeding stopped instantly because his statement was true. He was physically fine. He was just a walking lie detector in a building built on optimistic prognoses. After that, the hospital changed. Surgeons stopped joking with him. Nurses chose their words with agonizing slowness, watching his nose for the first sign of a leak. Conversations died when he entered the break room. Mike started carrying a dedicated roll of paper towels in his cargo pocket. He looked less like a medical professional and more like a crime scene in progress. At home, the silence was worse. Jane watched him from across the kitchen island. She had learned to be factual. "Dinner is chicken," she said. "No bleeding." "The weather will be rain," she said. Still dry. But the tension was a physical weight. One evening, Jane sat rubbing her temples.
"I'm
"Fine," she murmured. A thick, hot stream of blood hit Mike's dinner plate, swirling into the gravy. "You aren't," Mike said quietly. Jane gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "I just didn't want to start an argument, Mike. It's exhausting. I have to weigh every word like I'm under oath." "I didn't ask for this," Mike said. "But you're the one who's bleeding," she cried. Every time I try to be nice, you bleed on me. The breaking point came a week later. They were sitting on opposite sides of the bed. The room was dark, saving them from having to look at each other. Jane spoke into the shadows, her voice trembling. "I've never regretted marrying you." The blood started slowly this time, a steady, mournful crawl down his lip. Mike turned to her, his face a mess of stained tissues. "What part of that isn't true, Jane?" Jane didn't answer. She couldn't. Maybe she meant it 90% of the time. Maybe she regretted it only for a heartbeat during the Tuesday commute. But the condition of the wish didn't do percentages. It demanded a purity that humans weren't built for. She moved her pillow to the guest room that night. Mike began wearing heavy surgical bandages over the lower half of his face. Not to stop the blood. It just soaked through eventually. But to hide the evidence. He stopped correcting the lies. He stopped caring why they were told. He sat alone in his quiet apartment, listening to the muffled, careful world outside. He remembered the man from the forest, the dirt under his fingernails, and the way he'd looked worn thin, as if he were a vessel that had been emptied out. Mike understood now. The man hadn't been offering a gift. He had been looking for someone to carry the weight of the world's dishonesty. Amber stood before the floor-to-ceiling mirror in her penthouse, adjusting the silk of her dress. She looked perfect. She always did. Her life was a series of curated frames, and she was the master of the gallery. Since the hike, she'd felt a strange, humming anticipation. She had made her wish to truly know what people thought of her, and she expected it to feel like a throne. She expected to walk into rooms and feel the warm, golden glow of envy. The transformation didn't start with a bang, but with a sickening chemical smell. At a gallery opening that evening, Amber was holding court, a glass of champagne in one hand, and a practiced smile on her face. A social rival, Clara, approached her with a gushing compliment. "Amber, you look radiant, truly the star of the firm." But behind Clara's eyes was a sharp, jagged thought. "She's such a phony. We all know she only got that promotion because she slept with the boss." Amber felt a sudden, terrifying heat beneath her skin. Her pores didn't just close, they sealed. The silk of her dress began to fuse to her thighs with a melting hiss. Her skin lost its pores, its warmth, and its pulse, turning into a high-gloss, flash-colored polyethylene. When she tried to blink, her eyelids moved with a faint, audible click. Her face was becoming a static, unmoving mask. Perfect woman. Panic flared, and she tried to gasp, but her lungs felt like two stiff plastic bellows. As the people around her noticed her skin taking on a waxy, artificial sheen, their thoughts shifted from suspicion to mockery. "She looks like a mannequin, totally hollow." With every thought, Amber's joints hardened. She fled the room, her movements stiff and jerky, her heels clicking against the marble like hard plastic. By the time she reached her car, the plastic had softened, but the reset was incomplete. Her skin felt tacky, like wet paint. 2 days later, she tried to salvage her image by meeting a potential suitor for lunch. He was a man who prized authenticity, and Amber played the part perfectly. She was soft, vulnerable, and attentive. He reached across the table, taking her hand. "You're so different from the others," he says. "So genuine." But internally, he felt a flicker of predatory doubt. She's a shark. She's just hunting for a status symbol. The shift was violent. Amber felt her jaw unhinge, her mouth widening until it reached her ears. Her teeth lengthened into serrated, triangular blades that shredded her own lips. She tried to apologize, but her voice was a wet, guttural hiss. The man scrambled back, knocking over his chair. "Monster!" he shrieked. The word hit her like a physical blow. Because he saw a monster, her fingers fused into blackened, hooked talons that tore through the linen tablecloth. She was no longer a woman at lunch. She was a nightmare, born of his sudden terror. It was during her flight from the restaurant, huddling in the shadowed corner of a public park, that the memory finally surfaced. She saw the damp forest, the gray lights, and the man sitting on the log. She remembered the smirk she'd hidden behind her hand as she watched him eat the moldy crusts she'd offered. She remembered the casual cruelty of her wish. She had wanted to know what they thought because she believed her own lie, that she was a queen. She didn't realize that in a world of fickle, judgmental people, her body was no longer her own. It was a communal piece of clay. She was a snake to her assistants, so her skin began to itch with the arrival of scales. She was trash to the teenagers who saw her shivering in the park, and her expensive silk dress began to rot and fuse into her flesh like wet cardboard. The final descent happened in the lobby of her own building. The doorman, who had always been polite, watched her stumble in, covered in tattered cloak. He didn't feel pity. He felt a deep, instinctive disgust. She's a parasite, he thought. A hollow, ugly thing. Amber hit the floor as her bones softened and collapsed. Her legs fused into a useless, dragging tail, and her face became a blank, featureless mask of skin. She tried to cry out for help, but there were no vocal cords left in the hollow thing. Amber now lives in total darkness. She has covered every mirror in her apartment with heavy black velvet, but it doesn't help. She is a prisoner of her own proximity to the world. Even the muffled voices of neighbors through the walls, thinking of the freak in 4B, keep her body in a state of constant, agonizing mutation. She sits on the floor, her hands shifting between plastic, glass, and scales, waiting for the one thing she knows will never come. A single person to look at her and see nothing but Amber. She's realized, too late, that the man in the forest didn't give her a gift. He simply stripped away her skin and left her at the mercy of the world's eyes.